What's up, everybody? Today I wanted to make a little video about my sort of songwriting workflow for drum and bass tracks, kind of the neuro-funky bass music kind of stuff where you just have a bunch of crazy bass sounds flying around, and because I find that it can be quite difficult sometimes to write music for that because there's a big emphasis on sound design, but if you really delve into your sound design, then you kind of tend to lose track of the bigger picture a little bit. So in this video I'm just going to go through different methods that you can use to kind of focus on the general idea of the song, rather than getting lost in the details, because of course you can tell yourself like, okay, you know, next time I make a song I'm not gonna get lost in the details, but if you don't have any other behaviors to replace that getting lost in the sound design or the details or whatever, then you're not going to be able to make a change very easily. So I'm just going to go through some techniques. So yeah, let's start with the first technique, and this is using a low pass filter on the master. So I'm going to turn off this channel and I'm going to turn this on to show you kind of like an earlier version, because it took me a couple of attempts to come up with the riff that's used in the final track. And initially I wanted to make like this cool bass patch that does a bunch of modulation, and I had a nice bass sound and stuff, but you know, it's drum and bass. You have to make sure that the low end sounds exciting. Because that's what drum and bass is all about. So when I listen to the low end by turning on a low pass filter, there's all sorts of interesting things going on in the mid-range with this sound, but when we really focus on the low end, it's just a droning sub with kick drums here and there. In short, it wasn't really exciting me, so I decided that I wouldn't use the sound in that state. So instead I only ended up using the first little bit of it. So if you just turn off the low pass filter and listen to that, just a nice little FM stab with some reverb. And then if we listen to the rest of the riff through a low pass filter, I personally think that sounds quite exciting. Now you don't have to necessarily agree with me, it's just to illustrate that by using a low pass filter you can really focus on what's important if you're making bass music. The next important point is that it can be very useful to work around some kind of chord or some kind of harmonic element in the mid-range. Because if you're just focusing on bass, things can get boring and stale quite fast, but if you have a bit of a chord progression or even just a single chord to work around, that can sometimes provide a lot more context. Now, I initially with this tune wrote sort of this ARP synth thing that sounds like this. Yeah, you get the idea. I originally had that here in the drop, but it ended up becoming too cluttered and I moved it to the intro and breakdown sections. But the point is that having this here in the drop really helped me write some of these other bass notes, because then bass notes by themselves can sometimes feel a little empty, so having some kind of harmonic thing going on can help give those notes a lot more context that they need. And then of course when I decided to move that sound out of the drop, move the ARP out of the drop, then I had to kind of find other harmonic sounds to replace it with, so I still had some kind of harmonic context during the drop. So I ended up quoting some sections of the ARP that I wrote at the end of the 4 bars here with a different synth. Now, this is not a synth sound that I'm particularly happy with at this moment, but we'll get into why later. It's just for now it adds the harmonic context I needed, and I also decided to add a little bass stab, or sorry, not a bass stab, but just a chord stab. So then all of those things in context sound like this. And if I turn those off, then you'll hear that the riff sounds a lot more dull and a lot more empty. There's more emphasis on the bass sounds, and they sound cool, but I feel like I'm missing something when I play it without these mid-range harmonic sort of sounds. So I alluded to the synth sound before, and I kind of said that I didn't really like the way it sounded, but that's what I want to talk about now. Now, a lot of what I did during this track was using either presets that I'd made previously or samples that I'd made previously. In fact, the week before I started this track, I spent like a couple of days just going through old projects, released stuff, unreleased stuff, whatever, and just rendering out a bunch of the sounds I thought were cool and were worth saving. So like kicks, snares, bass sounds, you know, some of these chord stabs are built from sounds I got out of those projects. And this synth in particular is just a synth that, you know, I just open another project like this in the browser, and then you can drag in a channel like that. So that way I just took a synth from another project, so I already had some kind of sound to work with. And I might modify this sound before I finish up the tune, or I might try to remake it from scratch entirely. But, you know, the important thing here is that using some kind of pre-made sound allows me to really focus on the writing, and that's what's important. And that kind of an attitude kind of ties into also how I approached the sound design for this tune. There's this filler bass that I use here. It sounds like this. So the sound is kind of simple, and it's a synth patch that I whipped together quite quickly just to kind of get the general idea down. And then later on, when I decided that, okay, it was time to really work on some of the production and make some of the sounds pop, I felt that this particular bass sound didn't really pop out as much as I wanted it to, so I decided to duplicate the channel and just make a different layer. So this different layer sounds like that, and that just gives it a little more high-end information. It's also a lot wider in the stereo spectrum. So the general takeaway there is that you can make a synth patch that gets kind of close to the shape and the feel that you want, but you don't have to make it super exciting right now. That is something that you can do later in the production and mixing stages. But for now, if you're writing a tune, it can be very useful to just get a sound that is acceptable, that fits the riff, and then move on. Because that way you can keep focusing on how your track develops and you can stay in that workflow. And that's very important, I think. Speaking of layering sounds, layering is also a great way to kind of extend the life of some of your sounds. So you'll see that there's this particular bass sound, right? If we kind of zoom out, we can see that this sound is present in most of the tune. Pretty much the only sections where it isn't present is like this little breakdown here and the intro. So how do I get away with using one sound this much? Well, as you can see here in the instrument rack, there's all these different layers to the sound. This sound started out as an 808, and that was the original idea, but it kind of transformed into more of a standard neuro sort of stabby sound. I don't know. So if you listen to just the 808 layer, pretty straightforward. And then I just added a tonal layer where I did some FM to get a cooler sound out of that. And then finally a noisy layer. And that's kind of how I made the sound initially. And then to keep things fresh, I just switch out this tonal layer with different sounds. So in the first section of the drop, the sound sounds like this. And then in the B section of the drop, it sounds like this. And then even later on in the B section of the second drop, it sounds different still. Now, right now, they're maybe not mixed as nicely as I want to, but it's just a little thing that I did to kind of get more mileage out of one sound, because after using a sound for so long, like let's say in these 16 bars, I use pretty much the same sound, at some point it kind of starts to get stale. So you might want to think about doing something different after 16 bars, right? There's sort of this spectrum of options you have. You can make something completely different, completely new, and that can sometimes work out very nicely, but it can also be quite intimidating. It can pull you out of your writing workflow, and sometimes it just straight up doesn't work. This particular tune, I feel, is a kind of straightforward, simple tune. It's okay to kind of reuse the same sounds. I just needed to keep things fresh, so I decided to make all these different layers. And of course, using different layers and switching them in and out isn't the only way to keep a sound fresh. Another thing you can do is you can, of course, have variations in the notes that you're playing. So the first time we hear the sound, it plays, I believe that's just a bunch of F and then a bunch of E. And then the second time it plays. The intention of this variation is, again, to just keep things fresh, write something that's similar but different. That way it sounds coherent when you listen to the whole track, but it also doesn't sound too stale. Similarly, you can write variations in the drums, kind of depending on what kind of tune you have or what your personal style is. You might do a lot of like variations with your kick placements and stuff. So yeah, I hope this video helps you write your drum and bass tunes or whatever other kind of music you write. If you have any techniques that I haven't discussed in this video that you like to use for writing music, just leave a comment below, and that way we can all learn from it. Other than that, make sure to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and join my Discord server so you can share some cool samples with us, and then we can all benefit from that. Thank you for watching. Cheers.